They used to say a man like Elias Crowe was born with a gun in his hand and death on his heels. On the night this story truly began, Elias stood alone at the edge of Red Willow Gulch, watching the sun bleed out behind the hills. The wind carried dust through the empty street, whispering against the shutters of closed shops and the crooked sign of the saloon. This was a town that remembered him to Welland, forgave nothing. Elias Crowe had buried more men than he could name. Some deserved it. Some didn't. That truth sat heavy on his chest as he loosened the leather strap of his revolver, the worn grip polished smooth by years of killing. He had come back to Red Willow for one reason only, to disappear. The war between outlaws was over. The bounties had dried up, and the faces of the dead followed him into every dream. He planned to ride through town by morning, leave the territory behind, and die somewhere quiet where no one would remember his name. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. The cry came just after dusk, thin, broken, and desperate. It wasn't a coyote. It wasn't the wind. It was a child. Elias froze. For a long moment, he stood there, staring into the dark beyond the abandoned livery stable. He told himself it wasn't his business. He had learned long ago that stepping toward pain only brought more of it. Still, his boots moved before his mind could stop them. Behind the stable, half hidden by a collapsed fence, he found a woman slumped against the dirt wall. Her dress was soaked dark at the waist, blood seeping through her fingers as she pressed them tight. In her arms, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, was a newborn child, small, pale, and eerily still. Her eyes lifted to him, sharp with fear and resolve. Don't let them take him," she whispered. Elias knelt beside her, his knees aching, his breath shallow. "Who?" he asked. She swallowed hard. "The men from the ridge? They said he shouldn't be born? Said his blood was cursed?" The baby stirred, letting out a weak cry. Elias felt something inside him crack open or sound far louder than any gunshot. The woman grabbed his sleeve with surprising strength. "Please," she said. "You look like a man the devil knows better than God. That means you can protect him." Elias had heard a lot of things said about him over the years. Never that. He opened his mouth to refuse, to tell her he wasn't the man she thought he was, that he was empty, broken, too far gone to save anyone. But the words never came. Her grip loosened. Her head fell back against the wall. The life drained from her eyes as quietly as a candle going out. "Ma'am?" Elias said softly. No answer. The baby whimpered again, a fragile sound against the vast silence of the plains. Elias reached out, hesitant, as if touching the child might burn him. He lifted the small bundle into his arms. The boy's chest rose and fell, shallow but steady. Elias Crowe, feared gunslinger of 3 territories, stood there holding a newborn like he might shatter him. He looked down at the woman one last time, removing his hat in a rare gesture of respect. Then he turned toward town, the child pressed close to his chest. Inside the saloon, the air was thick with smoke and suspicion. Conversations died as Elias stepped through the doors. Every eye followed him, the scar on his cheek, the hard lines of his face, the gun at his hip. Then they noticed the child. A murmur spread, confusion, unease. Old Martha, the saloon keeper, leaned forward. Elias Crowe, she said slowly. What in God's name is that? A boy, Elias replied. Needs milk. And a place to stay. Someone laughed nervously. That the cursed child they've been talking about? The word cursed hung in the air like a bad omen. Elias felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. He adjusted the blanket, shielding the baby from prying eyes. He's just a child, he said, and he's stayin'. A chair scraped the floor, then another. From the back of the room, Sheriff Hank Miller rose to his feet. He was older now, slower, but his eyes were still sharp. You know what this means? The sheriff said quietly. Those men won't stop, and this town won't stand in their way. Elias met his gaze. For the first time in years, his voice didn't carry a threat-only certainty. Then they'll have to come through me. Outside, thunder rolled low over the hills, though the sky was clear. That night, Elias sat alone in a borrowed room above the saloon, rocking the child beside a flickering oil lamp. The boy's tiny fingers curled around his thumb, trusting without knowing why. Elias stared at the revolver resting on the table beside him. For the first time in his life, he wondered what it would mean not to draw it. Then, from somewhere beyond the town limits, a rifle shot cracked the night open. Elias went still. The baby stirred, and Elias Crowe knew the past had finally caught up to him. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to like and subscribe for more tales from the Old West. Let me know in the comments what you think happens next. Thanks for watching. The rifle shot cracked the night again, closer now. Sharper like the past, knocking on a door Elias Crowe had prayed would stay shut. He stood frozen for a breath, the baby warm against his chest, its tiny heartbeat fluttering like a trapped bird. Elias lowered him carefully onto the narrow bed, pulling the blanket up to the boy's chin. The oil lamp flickered, throwing shadows across the walls that looked too much like men he had buried long ago. Stay here, Elias whispered, his voice rough. Don't be afraid. The words felt foolish. The child had every reason to be afraid. So did he. Elias reached for his revolver out of instinct, then stopped. His hand hovered above the worn grip. Slowly, with a restraint that hurt worse than any bullet wound. He unbuckled the gun belt and laid it on the table. The leather hit the wood with a dull, final sound. For the first time since he was 16 years old, Elias Crowe stepped into danger unarmed. Outside hooves shifted. Men whispered. Elias closed the door softly and moved down the stairs. The saloon was dark, the smell of old whiskey and dust heavy in the air. Sheriff Hank Miller stood near the front window, rifle clenched tight, his jaw drawn hard. They found us, the sheriff said. Asked for the child by name? Elias nodded. They won't stop. No, Hank replied. They never do. Elias stepped into the street. Moonlight washed over Red Willow, pale and unforgiving. At the far end of town, 3 riders waited, their silhouettes sharp against the open plains. One man rode forward, confidence dripping from every movement. Well, I'll be damned, the man called out, his voice echoing in the quiet. Elias Crowe without his ire, never thought I'd see the day. Elias didn't raise his voice. You don't want what you're here for. The rider laughed, a harsh, grating sound. That boy's blood brings trouble. His mother knew it. That's why she ran. She ran because men like you chase what they don't understand, Elias said, his words cutting through the night air. The rider spat into the dirt. Step aside. You've killed enough men to know how this ends. Elias took one step forward instead. It ends with me, he said, his voice low but firm. Not the child. For a long moment, no one moved. The wind rolled through town, rattling a loose sign. Windows creaked as townsfolk watched from behind curtains, their fear weighing heavier than their shame. Then a gunshot rang out not from the street, but from the ridge above town. The lead rider jerked, slid from his saddle, and hit the dirt hard. Horses screamed. The other men scrambled, drawing their weapons, shouting into the dark. Weapons, shouting into the dark. Another shot, then another. From the ridge, a lone figure stood firm, rifle steady, posture unbroken. Sarah Whitcomb. Elias recognized her even before she stepped fully into the moonlight. Widow. Survivor. A woman who had buried a good man and learned the world wouldn't slow down for her grief. Leave, she shouted, her voice carrying across the distance. Or the next one won't miss. The riders didn't argue. They fled hard and fast, dragging their wounded companion with them, disappearing back into the darkness they'd come from. Silence followed, deep and trembling. Sarah lowered her rifle and began the walk down toward Elias. As she approached, she spoke quietly. You could have killed them. I didn't want the boy's first night to be written in blood, Elias replied, his gaze still fixed on the empty street. Sheriff Miller exhaled, the tension finally breaking. They'll regroup, he warned, stepping out of the saloon. Men like that always do. Elias knew it. The fire on the ridge, the one the riders had used as a signal, still burned. It was small but stubborn, a promise of what was coming. Back upstairs, Elias found the baby awake, his dark eyes tracking the lamplight like it was something sacred. He lifted the child gently, his movements awkward but careful. Sarah stood in the doorway, her rifle resting against the frame. You can't protect him alone, she said softly. Not against what's coming. Elias didn't look away from the child. I've been alone my whole life, he said. But I don't intend for him to be. That night, the truth spilled out of Elias like an old wound reopening. He spoke of the child's motherland, of how fear had hollowed her eyes, how she begged him to keep her son hidden from men who believed some bloodlines deserved extinction. He spoke of running, of hiding, of being told since birth that he was meant to end badly. I was supposed to die young, Elias said, his voice barely a whisper. People said my father's sins would finish me. Sarah listened without interrupting, her presence a silent, steady comfort. They were wrong, Elias continued, his gaze returning to the baby in his arms. And they're wrong about him. The baby stirred, a quiet sound full of life. Sarah asked gently, Does he have a name? Elias hesitated for just a moment. Then, with a certainty that surprised even himself, he said, Matthew. Outside, the fire on the ridge flared brighter, a burning ember in the vast darkness. And Elias Crowe understood the truth at last. Laying down the gun had not ended the fight. It had only begun a harder one. Dawn came slow and cold to Red Willow. The fire on the ridge still burned, a dull red eye watching the town from the hills, a scar against the pale morning sky. Elias Crowe stood on the porch of the saloon, the weight of a sleeping child against his chest. Matthew, wrapped in a blanket that smelled of soap and smoke, breathed with a steady rhythm. It was a sound Elias hadn't dared hope for just the night before. Stronger, stronger than anyone expected. Sarah Whitcomb joined him on the porch, the silence between them comfortable. She handed him a steaming tin cup of coffee. The warmth seeped into his cold hands. "Sheriff says they'll ride at first light," she said, her voice low. 5 men. Maybe more. Elias nodded, the movement slow, deliberate. He had known this morning would come. Some debts can't be outrun, no matter how far you ride or how fast you are on the draw. They follow you like a shadow, waiting for the moment you finally stop to catch your breath. He looked down at the small, trusting face of the boy in his arms. "I won't let them take you," he whispered. It wasn't a promise born from fear, but a vow carved from the very stone of his soul. He had spent a lifetime running from the man he was, only to find that the past had a way of catching up. But this time, he wasn't running. He was standing. For the first time in a long, long while, he had something to stand for. When the riders appeared, they didn't sneak in like thieves in the night. They came openly, spreading across the wide dirt road like men who believed the world owed them passage. Their leader, a man whose face was a roadmap of cruelties, dismounted with an arrogant swagger. His eyes were hard, his voice dangerously calm. "Crowe," he said, the name a curse on his lips. "You had your warning." Elias stepped forward off the porch. Matthew stirred, but didn't wake, still safe in the cocoon Elias had made for him. He could feel the eyes of the town on his back. Men and women who had lived too long under the thumb of others, their lives dictated by decisions made by men with guns and no conscience. Sarah moved to his side, her presence a silent declaration. Sheriff Miller stood firm a few paces away, his rifle held ready but not aimed. He was waiting. They were all waiting. Elias raised one hand, palm open, a gesture of peace that felt foreign and heavy. "This ends today," he said, his voice carrying in the still morning air. "You leave, and no one else gets hurt." The leader let out a short, humorless laugh. It was a grating sound, like rocks grinding together. "You think putting down your gun made you righteous, old man?" Elias met his gaze, unwavering. "No," he said, the words simple but profound. "It made me responsible." The man's smirk faltered. His hand drifted towards the pistol holstered at his hip. He lifted it hand, then he stopped. The townsfolk didn't scatter. They didn't run and hide behind bolted doors. They stepped forward, one by one. Old Martha from the saloon, her face etched with a lifetime of hardship. The blacksmith, his powerful arms crossed over his chest. A young ranch hand missing 2 fingers from a roping accident. A mother, clutching her own son's hand so tightly her knuckles were white. They formed a silent, unmovable wall of ordinary courage. The leader's eyes flicked from face to face, a flicker of uncertainty finally dousing his cold confidence. He had expected fear. He had expected a town to cower. He hadn't expected them to stand. This child, Elias said, his voice steady and clear, a testament in the quiet square, wasn't supposed to live, because men like you decide who deserves mercy and who doesn't. I spent my whole life believing violence was the only thing I was good for, the only language I could speak. I was wrong. He slowly, deliberately, reached into his long coat. For a heart-stopping second, the leader tensed, his finger tightening on the trigger. But Elias didn't pull out a weapon. He pulled out the gun belt he had carried for decades, the leather worn and familiar, the metal of the buckled dull. He held it for a moment, the weight of a lifetime in his hand, and then he let it fall. It landed in the dirt between them with a soft thud, a final, definitive end to an era. I won't kill for him, Elias said, his eyes locking with the leader's, but I will stand for him. For a long, breathless moment, no one moved. The tension was a physical thing, a wire stretched to its breaking point. Then Sarah lifted her rifle, so did the sheriff, and then others. Not to fire, not to threaten, but to refuse to be afraid. It was a silent, powerful chorus of defiance. The leader took a half-step back. You could see the war playing out on his face, pride warring with a sudden, dawning sense of survival. He wasn't facing one gunslinger. He was facing a town that had found its spine. At last, he spat into the dust, the gesture full of disgust and defeat. This ain't worth it, he muttered to his men. Without another word, they mounted their horses. They turned and rode away, not with the swagger of conquerors, but with the hurried pace of men who had misjudged their enemy. The fire on the ridge died before noon. Weeks turned into a season. Winter's harsh grip softened. The snow melted into mud, which soon gave way to the first green shoots of grass. Matthew grew stronger, louder, his laughter filling the quiet corners of the saloon Elias now called home. He learned the steady rhythm of Elias' heartbeat long before he learned the sound of his own voice. And Elias, he learned other things. He learned how to hold a child through nightmares without reaching for a gun. He learned how to laugh, a quiet, rumbling sound, so as not to wake the boy. He learned how to repair a leaky roof and how to listen to the stories of the townspeople. Most of all, he learned how to stay. The revolver, the one that had defined him for so long, remained locked away in a drawer. Not because he feared it, but because he no longer needed it to know who he was. His identity was no longer forged in gunpowder and death, but in small moments of peace and purpose. One evening, as the setting sun painted the plains in hues of gold and orange, Sarah stood beside him at the edge of town. Matthew was asleep in her arms, his small chest rising and falling peacefully. "You ever miss the man you were?" she asked softly. Elias watched the child, a feeling swelling in his chest that was more powerful than any adrenaline rush he'd ever known. "No," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I pity him." Sarah's responding smile was soft, understanding. Years later, travelers passing through Red Willow would sometimes hear the story. They'd speak of a legendary gunslinger who laid down his weapon, not in defeat, but in victory. A man who chose mercy over myth and community over conflict. They'd speak of a town that learned courage isn't always loud, that sometimes it's the quiet, collective will to stand your ground. And they would speak of a child who lived all, because one broken man decided his past would end with him. Elias Crowe was eventually buried on a hill overlooking the town he had stayed to protect. There was no gun carved on his simple wooden marker. No list of legendary deeds. Just a single line, etched deep into the wood: he stayed. And sometimes, in the quiet places, away from the noise and the glory, that is how the West was truly saved. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing for more tales of the forgotten heroes and quiet legends of the Old West. We'll see you next time.